Hello. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? I also want to make sure the people that my Lusophone and Francophone brothers and sisters can hear me. Please confirm. Is there translation? Bon. Bon. Yes. Okay. On commence, on commence. Donc, je m'appelle Auria Mozinho. I'm joking. I'll be speaking in English. But because this room is meant to be multilingual, if there are any, I'll ask you to keep your headsets ready in case there's some interventions from the floor in French or in Portuguese. So my name is Aurea Mozinho. I'm Policy Advocacy and Campaigns Coordinator at the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, GATJ. GATJ is a South-led coalition in the global tax justice movement that comprises regional networks, including Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia, TAFJA, Tax Justice Network Africa, TGNA, Red de Justicia Fiscal de América Latina y el Caribe, Tax Just Europe, and Canadians for Fair Tax and Fact Coalition. And all of these organizations collectively represent hundreds of organizations that work towards fairer taxation systems and policies worldwide. Together, we work for a world where progressive and redistributive tax policies counteract inequalities within and between countries and generate the public funding needed to ensure essential services and human rights. As the session suggests in the title, Shaky Pillars Don't Hold, Why Developing Countries in the Global South Should Reject the OECD Tax Deal. In this panel, we would like to discuss the implications of the OECD-led two-pillar solution to address the tax challenges arising from the digitalization of the economy, also known as two-pillar solution. And we would like to talk about how this two-pillar solution affects domestic resource mobilization prospects for developing countries across the global south, not just Africa. We will also be addressing how and why global south countries should collaboratively work together to overcome the pitfalls of this solution. And critically, what are the pathways for advocacy to negotiate for decision-making around international tax rules to move from the OECD, a de facto club of rich nations, to the United Nations, a forum where all countries stand on equal footing and where rules of engagement and decision-making are clear and substantively inclusive. It is my honor to welcome you all. And it's also my honor to welcome Indomitable. Yesterday I was called that, and I think it's fitting for this panel, an indomitable panel of advocates and campaigners within the broader economic justice movement and the tax justice movement. And in this room, we have Dereje Alamayo, who is the executive coordinator of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, also my boss. And then we have Stefano Prato, who's managing director at the Society for International Development, SID. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We'll be joined online from Philippines by Jeannie Manapon. Jeannie that is Development Finance Program Manager at the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, APMDD, a member of the GATJ Coordination Committee, and also a representative of Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia. And in absentia, we'll be reading a speech from Luis Moreno. Luis that speaks to us from Latin America and Argentina, if I'm not mistaken. And he's the Tax Justice Coordinator at Latin DAD and also chair of the GATJ Coordination Committee. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all. I'm sure you've heard a lot about this issue in the last 2 days. What we're trying to do here is continue the conversation and deepening it to a large extent, talking about going beyond the niceties and actually talking about advocacy issues and urgent advocacy issues relating to the OECD two-pillar solution and the prospect for a UN tax convention. So I'll start with Dereje. And the question to you is, as you frame the discussion, why should we even be talking about this again? Yesterday, during the discussions, we heard, well, there's an OECD two-pillar solution. Global South countries should move together and find a Global South solution. What are the constraints, the real binding constraints that the OECD advancing on this issue poses for countries in Africa and across the Global South? And why should we not just be moving towards alternative solutions, but also rejecting very vehemently the OECD solution? Over to you, Dereje.
I don't know what to do. Thank you very much. I have two personal reasons to be happy speaking on this topic. The first reason is because I'm an African. When we started the tax justice movement in Africa, whenever we used to ask a simple question at the beginning. Do you think resources flow out of Africa? And if they flow, who is responsible for that? Invariably, the answer is, we are too poor. There can be no resources going out of Africa. If at all anything flows out, then it is because of our corrupt leaders. So there was a strong belief in the fact that Africa is on the life support it gets from the north, that resources flow more into Africa, and if you lose resources, it is because our corrupt leaders steal it from us. As usual, for me personally, I've said it many times, our corrupt leaders are pickpockets, the robbers are elsewhere. So that is why, for me, when we talk about domestic resource mobilization, we have to keep in mind that the loopholes in our system that lead to resource leakages are caused by international context, are caused by the rulemaking and by the rules governing international economic and taxation systems. So that is why when TJNA with ATAF were organizing this pack, we negotiated with them to have this session to show it's not that we neglect the homework that we have to fight our corrupt leaders, we have to close domestic loopholes, but also not to lose sight of the fact that the structures internationally block us by keeping the loopholes open from domestic resource mobilization. So why is this question important? Because Africa cannot close the loopholes for the drainage of resources from its continent until and unless the global system changes. And the global system can only change if Africa actively participates in changing the global structures and systems. So that is essentially why, I have been accused of being supporter of corrupt African leaders. It is not that. It is making a distinction between pickpockets and robbers. And if you are against robbers, that does not mean you justify pickpockets. You just are giving things perspectives. So this is my introduction. I hope I did not take a lot of time for the introduction. Now to the point. We have been, as Global Tax Justice, which by the way was created under the leadership of TJNA, to have a global alliance which is based on structurally led by Southern coalition, a global alliance based on Southern leadership. That is what the global alliance is all about. Africa, Asia, and Latin America are the forces which structurally lead the global alliance for tax justice. And TJNA has played a pivotal role in creating the global alliance. Again, also to be in a position to talk on behalf of the South with the Southern voice. because in the past, be it in the civil society sector, be it in international processes, others spoke for us. If you were to talk about hunger in Africa, the first that comes to mind is an INGO and not a local organization. So that is also what we wanted to change. So we were trying to do two things. On the one hand, it was really to negatively engage with the OECD process, meaning to show its shortcomings, both in terms of content and process. And the other one was to fight for a better alternative which will take into consideration the interests of developing countries. So what I will try to do is, what was the reason for us to engage with the OECD process, and what were we proposing as an alternative? Unfortunately, Tove Riding, who wrote on behalf of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice and Eurodad, the draft discussion paper on UN Tax Convention, who was to present that project, had a tragical family tragedy. She could not join us. So, by the way, I thank Stefano, who is a long-time friend and comrade, who volunteered to stand in and cover the area which was supposed to be covered by Tove. So, the international tax rules need to be changed. For this to come to this conclusion, we just need to look at the age. It was formulated over 100 years ago. The practice were developed over 100 years ago. At this 100, when the League of Nations started it, most African countries were under colonies. Asian countries were also under colonies. It was a rulemaking which was set by former colonial powers. It has not changed a lot. It is not adapted to the current political situation, current geopolitical situation. That is one. The second one is the way capitalism is organized globally has changed. The role of finance, globalization in all its aspects, which I cannot go into detail, has changed a lot. And there is the business model, especially of corporations, has changed. I heard it from Alvin first, and now I'm saying it several times. One reflection of this change of model is that the biggest transport company in the world does not own cars. Uber. You have a situation, for example, which we used to use to explain how things are. The Isle of Jersey, which is a small island between France and England, is the biggest banana exporter to the Western European countries. When you hear about a building in Cayman Islands where there are 12,000 companies registered, it tells you how the business model has changed. The business model is constructed in such a way that it makes profit shifting legal. The whole, I cannot again go into this, that is a broken system which cannot regulate the current transaction. So that is one of the reasons. So that it has to change is a very clear thing. Then the issue is now, who is responsible to changing these international tax rules and practices? If the former was led and agreed at the League of Nations, logically the follow-up organization should have been made responsible to do this change. That is the United Nations. But it did not go that way. If you want to protect privilege, you are necessarily against democracy. You cannot maintain privilege if there is democracy. So the rich countries have their club, which is called OECD. They don't want the United Nations, which is a democratic and universal organization, to be in charge of these reforms. They want it to be dominated by the OECD. They do this through two things. They have two methods to do it. One is they try to co-opt as many countries as possible in an informal structure which has no jurisdiction to rule over universal laws. And the second one is to block the issue from getting into the United Nations. So they have been doing this both things. So we have been exposing that the OECD rules are working in favor of rich countries because the old structure favors source countries. That means countries, residence countries, that is countries where the multinationals are registered and domiciled, and source countries where they generate their profits. So this equilibrium to keep the tax rules, global tax rules, in such a way that they favor residence countries is continuing throughout the process of reform within, I have only 3 minutes. So the OECD, if you look at the solutions, the two pillar solutions, which are shaky, not only shaky to us, but also shaky for themselves. Pillar 1, it only regards 10%, maximum 10% of the global profits that the multinationals make. 90% will continue in the old way. So for a rule which has been dominating for 100 years, reforming only 10% of it is useless and meaningless. The second one is it is not going to be practiced at all because it makes a very funny distinction between residual and routine profit, which no accountant has ever discovered. That is, so now, which makes it impossible for revenue authorities, that has been also referred to by Ataf yesterday, the fact that it is so complicated it will not be usable. This is another thing. We are also opposed to the process. I cannot go in detail at the gunpoint. So the other one is the process is not transparent at all. There is manipulation and bullying behind the scenes. ATAF has been always protesting against the political pressure on negotiators within the inclusive framework. I have also read from ATAF report that sometimes they get a manuscript of how many pages on Friday to decide on it by Monday. So all this manipulation process, it's not transparent. Even countries have no access to the documents being discussed. So in the case of the United Nations, the process is open. Countries participate on an equal footing. And we as civil society has the possibility of A, influencing the position of our respective governments, and B, also in an open process, influencing the final outcome. So it is an open process which makes it possible for us to influence. If you look at what is happening at the inclusive framework which the OECD created, there is no such possibility to opaque. But now one final thing. It is also the OECD process, the two-pillar solution, is shaky not only for us but also for them. In the first place, there is no possibility that the American Congress is going to ratify Pillar 1. Pillar 1 needs ratification by domestic legislation. Now, the thing is, South Center also points it makes no point for developing countries to sign on an agreement if the principal target of that law is not going to be bound by it. So if the US does not sign it because 70% of the 100 multinational companies targeted by the reform are US-based. So if the US is not going to accept application of these new rules to them, there is no point then for developing countries to cede their taxing rights. So in short, it denies developing countries their taxing rights, cements the denial of taxing rights of developing countries. If you look at the minimum tax Pillar 2, 15%, ATAV has been asking, civil society have been asking 25%. OECD refused all these demands and put it at 15%, because it was what the notorious tax havens like the Republic of Ireland were demanding. 12.5% is closer to 15 than to 25. So this least common denominator which the OECD is proposing is adjusted to the interests of the very notorious jurisdictions which are the vehicles of profit shifting. So it is to save them that the whole thing is being taken into consideration. At any rate, I'm under time pressure to continue. What is happening now are two things. They have failed to conclude it according to their own schedule. It was to be concluded next week in October. They were not able to do that because they are not agreeing among themselves about that. The US is dancing its own music. So what they have done now is they have postponed the decision to mid-2023. And now, instead of the previous thing of saying unanimous agreement on the platform, they have started saying if enough number of countries agree to it, it will be universal. What does this imply? There will be a universal rule which is binding to developing countries, but to which America and the rich countries, if they want, will not be participating. So hand-tying developing countries, because the first thing they want to do is to prevent us from imposing unilateral measures like digital services tax. If you sign these agreements, you agree not to do that. A binding agreement of not taxing digital companies on your own. So preventing you from taking unilateral measures and being bound by laws which favor them, that is the purpose of the OECD reform. That is why we say no to the tax deal of the rich, bring the issue of global tax reform to the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dereje. So now we'll move on to some statements from our colleagues in the different regional networks. I'll start first with the statement from RED, the Justicia Fiscal, that was sent by Luis Moreno, with the help of Clelia, that both work at Latin Dad. Please indulge me as I read for you. This will help will go very much in line with what Dereje was saying about the shaky pillars, why it doesn't make sense for developing countries, and why there's really an urgent need to catalyze on the demands for a UN solution instead of signing on to a solution that is not inclusive, despite the name of inclusive framework, that it doesn't represent the interests of developing countries, and that above all breaks all of the rules about process and then doesn't have fair outcomes. So this is what Luis said. Since the G20 calls for progress on rules to address base erosion and profit shifting, and the launch of the 2015 BEPS inclusive framework, a set of tools have been developed to enable signatory states to address tax abuse by multinational companies. However, as designated, they do not solve the central problem of tax fraud on the one hand, and on the other hand, developing countries continue to be left out of the most important decisions in this framework. Since then, a complex process of addressing the rules for taxing digital economy companies has been underway under the so-called two pillars solution of the BEPS inclusive framework, in which Pillar 1 seeks to focus on a reallocation of taxation rights to market jurisdictions, and Pillar 2 addresses the issue of applying a global minimum tax. This is even though the agreed minimum tax of 15% is too low to effectively deter tax competition, as, according to the 2021 OECD statistics, average corporate tax rates are 26.8% in Africa, 19.2% in Asia, and 19.1% in LAC. Moreover, the lack of inclusion of conditions is expected to generate unequal benefits, with only a 2% increase in corporate tax collected for developing countries compared to 19% increase for developed countries. In LAC, in particular, homogeneity of action can be detrimental when considering the heterogeneity of realities within the region. Some example of this particular context can be examined in the case of Argentina and Costa Rica. At the beginning of the process, Argentina, with an average tax loss of 1.22 1.125 million US dollars, publicly expressed its disagreement with the proposed conditions. However, as more countries decided to sign up, Argentina decided to take the advantage of this opportunity to challenge the status quo, even when it wasn't ideal. One incentive for these was the aggressive local collection tax targets that the tax administration and ministries have to achieve, which make anything that can help attractive. In the case of Costa Rica, with an average corporate tax rate of 30% and an estimated annual tax loss of 359 billion, the main doubt comes from its free trade zones and other attractive initiatives for investment that are often associated with the development of the country. And perhaps the proposed 15 minimum tax would not affect this privilege granted to these tax-free zones. This is to say, even the implementation of the minimum tax would not affect these tax privileged zones due to the very low threshold that this initiative represents, on the one hand, and on the other hand, due to the standards that are proposed as the threshold for turnover of profits established for such purposes. In a context where the economic, social, and climate crises have impacted our societies, where the rich have become richer, exacerbating global inequalities, it is improbable that a proposal such as Pillar 2 would be beneficial to address the challenges of resource mobilization necessary to face the post-COVID-19 recovery. The conclusion of this proposal, as set out, leaves us with some clear messages. First, that developing countries continue to be on the margins and lagging behind in global decision-making. Second, that developing countries, on the one hand, face greater complexity in dealing with this process due to financial, technological, and capacity constraints faced by tax administrations and control bodies, and, on the other hand, as the various evidence has shown, that the effort to deal with this process will end up leading to minimal revenues for most developing countries. In this framework, the process should be fair and inclusive. In this framework, this decision reaffirms the domination of the richest country's position, even though in theory the process should be fair and inclusive in terms of recovering the profits generated by corporations and the effective participation of our countries in the new global rules. This is an agreement made by rich countries for the benefit of rich countries. Now more than ever, it's necessary to create a space for articulation in which global decisions on systemic reforms on the financial and fiscal architecture are considered within a framework of truly equal conditions and participation of all countries. In this framework, a first step such as the establishment of a UN tax convention would provide a unique opportunity to promote a truly global and fair framework for countries in the world. The African Finance Minister's Declaration, the calls of civil society organizations such as the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, the Coalition for Financial Transparency, TGNA, and other organizations around the world support the need for true multilateral democratic reform of tax system that is fair, transparent, and inclusive for all countries. A mouthful. So that is Luis from Latin America, and I really want to shift to Stefano right now. Luis here talks about it's necessary to create a space for articulation in which global decisions on systemic reforms of financial and fiscal architecture are considered. And we know that traditionally an important space for civil society organizations engaged in fiscal and financial justice advocacy has been the financing for development conferences. The issue of the UN Tax Convention has emerged before in previous UN convention and FFD conferences, right? In Montreal and more recently in Addis, but it's never, actually materialized. Why would a new FFD be important to move the lever? Why would it be different since the blockages remain the same, with rich countries still not having interest in moving negotiation towards a UN platform? And in the context of the advances with the OECD inclusive framework, which is something that we didn't have 15, 30 years ago, why would that serve as a counterweight? And I want you to comment on that, particularly in light of the recent statement by the UN General Secretary supporting the establishment of a UN tax convention.
Thank you so much. And of course, I can't pretend to step into this in Tove's shoes, right? So, I guess I'll take my own spin to this. And in particular, of course, here, once again, I'll be speaking more in my role as a coordinator of the Global Civil Society Financing for Development mechanism, which is the inclusive mechanism with a very clear and strong Southern leadership that has engaged in the process from the beginning. Let me do three things here. The first one is at the cost of being repetitive for those of you that know everything about it, just say a few things about the FFD process so that we at least get on the same page on what we're talking about. And then secondly, let me explain what is the current status of play in terms of what is happening and what is the timeline and the decisions ahead. And then let me zoom in on the tax convention and what the decision may entail and what are the challenges that we may confront as we actually confront the negotiations. So first of all, on the FFD process, three main issues. First of all, its genesis. The United Nations Financing for Development process really starts after the sequence of conference of the 90s that have somehow shaped the development agenda in very aspirational terms, but with a very strong call by developing countries and also in the aftermath of a dramatic economic crisis, there was a need to really understand what are the conditions in terms of the removal of the systemic obstacles to socio-economic transformation, in particular to expanding the policy and fiscal space of developing countries in advancing in their development pathways. So the term financing for development is somehow misleading because it somehow evokes the idea of bridging a financing gap. But it's really not about this. It's really an agenda for systemic reforms, mostly governance reforms. They are aimed at rebalancing and shifting the barycenter away from developed country institutions in favor of a new ecosystem of economic governance organizations that will be truly multilateral in scope. You know, really the spirit of the process has been this from its inception. Secondly, that's a genesis, but what is its character? Is a global normative process. So it's a space where member states take decisions. It's driven, first and foremost, by the intergovernmental negotiations between member states. That basically means that it evokes the primary and probably most important role of the United Nations as a normative space which has global jurisdiction. And this is important if you compare it to many other pretend to be economic governance locus in which, in fact, jurisdiction isn't even there, including in the G20. No? The only thing they can do is they can coordinate, but they do not have jurisdiction, the capacity to take decisions, make them binding, and make sure that those decisions become framing of our, in this particular case, global economy. So that's a genesis, very strong developmental framing after the conference of the 90s and strong normative character based on the decisions of UN member states. But it's also important to recognize the kind of agency that the FFD process pulls in. It's an international conference under the aegis of the United Nations, but within which the World Bank, the IMF, even the WTO are some of its institutional stakeholders. So even if in a very, very strong manner it evokes the idea and is based on the premise that the member states' decisions are sovereign and they need to call into coherence and alignment the ecosystem of current organizations. Now, some of you are thinking, oh, that's kind of a fairy tale I'm going to use at Christmas for my kids because it sounds so good. What it has actually achieved in 20 years, so since literally Monterey 2002. And some people will say, well, I don't see these decisions having been made. Well, I want to counter that argument. I think what it has achieved is left a window for economic governance open within the United Nations, and has generated a counter institution and a counter process to the hegemony of developed country institutions. And I think this has been particularly the case on an issue such as tax, in which constantly there's been this juxtaposition between the attempts that Dereje has so clearly described of developed countries to take their own decisions in their own spaces and then bring everyone in line with those versus developing countries claiming that they need to take decisions into a different space. So I would say maybe we haven't achieved concrete decisions through that process, but the very fact that the struggle is up and running and is coming today to, I would say, a critical tipping point, I think is in itself an important result. And I could say something similar on debt and maybe a couple of other issues. So on all of these, what is happening now? There's been an initial conference in 2002 in Monterey, there's been a review conference in Doha, then the Addis conference most recently in 2015. Now, civil society has been calling, even before the crisis, for a new financing for development 4. Because we felt that many important issues were not concluded, and despite the fact that the Addis conference has agreed an annual follow-up process, it was very clear that the follow-up process could only reach, let's say, the limit of what was already agreed in Addis. There was no mandate in New York by the UN delegates to move beyond what was agreed and what wasn't agreed. And that we recognized that very quickly, and that's the reason why very quickly we said, okay, fair enough. We need to have a new process, a new ministerial conference that really resolves what was left unresolved in Addis. Dereje would normally say that in Addis we managed to achieve defeat because we managed to keep the struggle for the intergovernmental tax body open until the very last minute, despite the attempts of just about everyone to try and close that issue that before. So the General Assembly now in October will take a final decision on whether to call for FFB4. And our sense politically, my colleague Pooja, many of you know, is currently in New York in active dialogue with delegates, is that this decision will be happening. I want to run the risk of saying, oh, this guy said, and then it didn't happen. Let me run the risk. I think it will happen. And this means that in between 2024 and 2025, probably, there will be another conference. That means that there will be the initiation of a process of negotiation that will see a number of preparatory committees in which the agreement that is eventually sealed at FFD4 will be discussed. Now, this will be our primary turf for advocacy. I've already explained yesterday, and I won't repeat here, the reason why this is important. Dereje is also recognized it. But there's a couple of things that is important to stress, because they are important in our advocacy campaigning. There are a number of dangers in the negotiations. Now, we start clearly with a very strong position of the African region, also thanks to the decision at the May meeting of the African finance ministers to really call for a UN tax convention. This is a major piece. However, there are a number of challenges. I would say mostly three. The first one, and I think Irene articulated it very well yesterday when she spoke, there's so many gaps, bureaucratic gaps, or simply disconnect between how to translate that political decision into actual decision into the negotiations. And this is important to mention because we somehow think that therefore the turf where we have this discussion in New York only, it is not. You know, there are significant elements of disconnect at country level between the diplomatic position and the ministries of finance. Let's never forget that the ministries of finance, no matter where they come from, they studied in the same place, they go to the same clubs, you know, and therefore they are a subculture in itself, okay? And they continue to identify the World Bank and the IMF as the space where they do business, no matter what we say here. You know, so there is an explicit challenge that we have in tackling and addressing some of these gaps. The second one, I would say, it's a certain level of disconnect between the interests of some countries, for which in particular the issue of IFF is very significant, and therefore they're willing probably to go all the way in the struggle, and countries for which this is much more distant in their immediate concern. And typically, the first thing that happens when you have some of these negotiations is that there is immediately an initiative targeting SIDS, small island states, and there is normally initiative targeting least developed countries. Why? Because the attempts of developed countries is to break the unity of the global south by simply offering peanuts, developing cooperation left and right, which will be more corresponding to the immediate needs of some countries that do not see in systemic reforms what is going to change their reality in the immediate coming year. Now, how to deal with this? We need to be aware that it's difficult and actually probably not a good idea purely to campaign on the tax body alone. We need to be able to really have a comprehensive agenda, which is what the civil society FFD group always have, that caters for different country situations and is able therefore to offer a package of decisions that, in a sense, where everyone finds what is important for them in an effort to really keep the unity of the global south. Now, let me conclude with the fact that in all of these, certainly, the guiding star will be the decision on the intergovernmental tax body or the convention itself. Why this is important is because we've seen in the United Nations in the past period the predominance of a form of theatrical multilateralism in which we talk, we chat, you know, we have a lot of red carpets, but decisions are actually happening. For me, taking this decision really generates a turning point in the role of the United Nations in taking decisions, in reclaiming their normative and jurisdictional power. So this is important not only for the tax community, it is important for everyone else because it generates that moment of discontinuity, that moments of change in the way in which we'll deal with global economic governance. But at the same time, we also need to be aware that we need to include this in a comprehensive approach. Now, we will continue to be asked, what can a tax convention do? Okay? And I'm just going to list, without articulating, a few critical issues, which I think you find very well articulated in the proposal model tax convention that Eurodad and GACE with Eurodad support has actually articulated and shared with delegates. Well, the first important element of the convention is it establishes a new global tax architecture centered on an intergovernmental global tax body or authority, whatever you want to call it. Secondly, it takes a particular and explicit focus on illicit financial flows, you know, and therefore it's very explicit in strengthening the global fight for that. It also, third, promotes greater fairness towards developing countries, and therefore it needs to be explicit in addressing the policy bias in favor of developed countries that current, as disarticulated as can be, tax regimes include. It, of course, includes a very strong link with the development agenda, with human rights, and of course, the developmental nature of that particular space. It needs to create global coherence and reduce complexity. And this is particularly important because it needs to create a pathway to gradually reduce and replace the highly complex network of institutions and regulations that we currently have. And I think in this it can also introduce a stepwise approach towards future and more detailed intergovernmental agreement that can actually tackle more specific issues. It, of course, needs to replace the failed transfer pricing system, and that's, it needs to be a critical element of the convention, and in conjunction with its focus on IFFF. And of course, add all the famous ABC package of transparency, and therefore automatic information exchange, beneficial ownership, and public country-by-country reporting. And lastly, it needs to create conditions for countries not having to be somehow obliged to comply to controversial dispute settlement, dispute resolution mechanisms. So these are some of the elements that I think the model tax convention put forward. And I think the actual negotiations may be different, and this is not now the negotiation on the actual convention. We need to agree to initiate that process, and the process will have its own modalities and its own timeline. But when we do that, we need to have clarity of what the convention could serve, and these are elements that can propose possible entry points to ensure that particular clarity. I think I'll stop here. I've probably spoken already too much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stefano. Thank you, Dereje. I want to check if Jeannie is online. Hi, Jeannie.
Hello, I'm here.
Good, welcome. Good to have you. I can see you, which is good. Jeannie, I think you heard Dereje and Stefano, and I wanted to shift to you and shift gears to hear from you a little bit about the work that TAFJA has been and MPMDD have been doing in the region on tax justice advocacy, and how do you tie those local and regional demands to the global demands that are being made and were articulated in this panel? So over to you.
Thank you very much. We would like to share a video first just to capture and share with you the mood right now among the tax justice community and tackling the realities in the region. I wonder if we can, if I can ask my colleague to share screen. Pat, are you there? Okay. Oh, let me check if I can share screen. Last week we had, oh, I see she's not able to screen.
So we're also trying to see if someone here can share.
Let me try.
Okay.
But last week, let me just say very quickly, last week we had what we call Days of Action, Asian Days of Action on tax justice. Now, this is really calling for tax justice for people's recovery. This is really bad because my internet connection is not, it's a little bit unstable. On the theme, tax justice, it's an Asian Days of Action for tax justice towards ending inequalities and building people's recovery and resilience. Last year, we also had, around the time that the UN General Assembly was also meeting, we also called for Days of Action for tax justice, and we focused on the theme, on the call for progressive taxation in national systems, but also in ending inequalities in global tax rules and rulemaking, and calling for a rejection of the tax deal of the rich. So we did a lot of popular education about the OECD, and how the elite biases and gender biases in our national tax are also mirrored in some ways in the global tax, in international financial architecture and in global tax rules, inequalities in global tax rules and rulemaking. But this year, we really want to see solutions. We really want to see action. And the video that I was going to share with you was captured somehow the actions, the activities that had taken place in 5 countries in Asia, in Bangladesh, in India, in the Philippines, in Nepal, in Pakistan, especially in Pakistan, where which dramatically really shows how the impacts of the convergence of multiple crises. And we believe that a central feature of the solutions that we are looking for to really build genuine people's recovery has to do with fixing the broken system that Lereje has already talked about, uh, and also correcting the biases in tax systems at all levels.
Did we lose Ginny? Okay. Okay, why don't we do the following? Why don't we maybe take a couple of questions, and while that's being sorted, so I'll open. Yeah. So while that's being sorted, I'll open up, take a couple of maybe 3 questions, and then we can continue the conversation while we wait for Jeannie. So over to the audience. I'll register 1, 2, 3.
Recording in
Grassroots
progress.
communities to
Oh, okay. Just a second. Hi,
amplify
Jeannie.
our voices and our demands on this is the undemocratic character and nature of the OECD. We do not recognize that it is the legitimate body for for building normative frameworks, and that is why it's very important to really push for a UN tax body and a UN tax convention. We draw inspiration from the initiatives in Africa, especially the African finance ministers that have called for this. Um, we see that there is progress because recently the UN Secretary General, in his report on combating illicit financial flow, explicit explicit mentioned the need for saying that a global convention on tax with universal participation. And for us, we would also emphasize not just participation, but participation uh, will be forward. So these are very good signs for us of progress, but we really need to push. Oh, Brian, you are here. Do you have the link to the video? Before, if we still have a chance to show the video, I'd also like some time for that. But my one of my main points that I would like to that we really look forward to is that we have been watching closely the exciting initiatives, developments in Africa, especially this event that this African Tax Administrators Forum and our colleagues in Tax Justice Network Africa. We do not have such a space or such in our region, and we really feel we have a lot to learn from you. We've monitored the history of the initiatives here from the Mbeki panel, and up to now that we draw some inspiration for this push for the UN Tax Convention. And what Stefano said about the leadership of Global South is really very important, and that's something I would like to emphasize. We look forward and to more exchanges and collaboration between the Global South regions, and really to push for reforms to correct the flaws in the global tax system. Let me check if the video is
Unfortunately not, Ginny. The internet connection here is a bit
Oh, okay.
choppy.
Well,
Uh,
it was just fresh from the oven. Actually, you will see it in YouTube once it's uploaded. But I thought you would be the first audience. So anyway, let me close with that. Yeah, in case you have. I'm sorry about my internet connection.
no, Ginny, we could hear you. We lost you just for a little bit, but we could hear you and we could get your points. I'll ask to stay for a little bit in case there's some questions for the audience, and maybe you can make some final remarks in a bit. So there were 3 questions or comments. I'll start from my left with my brother there. Over to you. Please say your name and your organization.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Afternoon. My name is Chinedu Basi. I'm from Nigeria. I work for TI Nigeria. I have a comment and a question, and directly to Mr. Dereje. While I acknowledge he's a veteran in this whole course, it's been a long while. But there's an issue that I don't agree with, that he spoke about our leaders being pickpockets and the robbers are somewhere. Maybe it's different in other places, but in my country, Nigeria, there is an indigenization policy which gives a majority ownership to the local government, either by, the federal government itself must have a greater percentage of ownership for any multinational company that is operating in the country. And that makes them a major stakeholder in any businesses that is operating. So if we agree that the leaders are pickpockets and the robbers are elsewhere, what's the relationship between these companies and these leaders that you are exonerating? How are they playing? What is their involvement? How much of these illicit financial flows comes back into their pockets? What's their level of involvement in even the contracting itself? Because at the end of the day, they are the ones that signs off the contracts and the terms that has to do with that. That's one. Secondly, it's good enough to hear all the wrong things that is contained in the OECD propositions and the reason for us to reject it. Good enough accepted. But the question is, how does that help the African cause? If we reject that, will it stop our leaders from giving incentives? Because, the OECD minimum is 15. In my country, our minimum is 0, technically, because almost all the indigenous companies, not even foreign ones, are all on pioneer status. As of 2019, the 22 indigenous companies operating in the extractive sector are all on pioneer status. So we are at minimum 0. So how do the rejection help us? Will it stop the African leaders from giving these incentives to the same companies that we are also fighting against?